Welcome to the asynchronous portion of week 6. In this final week of the course, we will briefly reflect on and discuss the opportunities and challenges of doing business in emerging markets. It would also be appropriate at this time to take a step back and look back at week 1 to see how I set the stage of the course. You hopefully will recall that I began the course by identifying a set of basic yet key questions about emerging markets. The starting point for this set of questions was, of course, to determine what we mean when we talk about emerging markets. And we did spend some time in week 1 to clarify that question, including shedding light on the differences between emerging and frontier markets. The latter also being referred to, as you may recall, as pre-emerging markets. We proceeded to a geographic identification of emerging and frontier markets. And in weeks 4 and 5, we covered emerging market regions ranging from East and Southeast Asia to Northern Africa and the Middle East, and finally Sub-Saharan Africa. In this context, you not only received the broad overview of the regions in questions, but in some instances also got more focused information about specific countries. And the one that we spent probably the most amount of time on was China, which is not surprising given the fact that it is decidedly still an emerging market, but also, depending on how you measure GDP, is already either the second largest or the largest economy in the world. We also complemented these discussions with country-specific as well as company-specific case studies, including operational decisions about whether to exit or to remain committed to an emerging market, as illustrated with our Santon manufacturing case study centered around Laos, acquisition decisions, such as the takeover of Turkey's Meiki by the spirits giant Diageo, etc. Additionally, the in-class discussions as well as the lecture videos also shed some light on the motivations for doing business in emerging markets. The draw of emerging markets, of course, centers around economic growth and market potential first and foremost, but is also influenced by strategic decisions made by competitors, which prompts companies to follow suit or risk being a latecomer to what may be a potentially promising new market opportunity. The question of timing related to emerging markets expansion, meanwhile, was addressed at least in part through discussions about institutional perspectives, institutional voids, and overall risk factors that need to be taken into account in the overall analysis and decision-making in order to make strategic commitments to emerging and frontier markets. As we established in in-class discussions, careful situational analysis and identification of risk factors, ranging from political, economic, and social risks, all the way to technological, legal, and environmental considerations, is not a mere luxury, but rather a critical necessity before committing to an emerging market. After all, appreciating the reality and complexity of relevant risk factors increases the possibility of effectively managing, if not outright mitigating, operational risk. This issue of risk identification and timing of emerging market expansion was powerfully illustrated in the Russia-focused case study of Hermitage Capital Management. In fact, Bill Browder's experience served to remind us of the importance of gaining a clear understanding of political developments. In this case, the gradual consolidation of power by Vladimir Putin, which over time led to Bill Browder's naming and shaming campaign no longer being as effective by the mid to late 2000s as it had been in the late 90s and early 2000s. In the intervening years, the highest levels of government in Russia, including Putin himself, had become ever more ensnared in the structural corruption that prevails in the Russian economy today, and yet Bill Browder had failed to appreciate this development over time and the degree and extent to which it would come to present a clear and present operational danger for him and his company. The importance of being attuned to developments on the ground in emerging markets, including perhaps most importantly announcements of or changes to government policies, economic market liberalization trends, etc., cannot be stressed enough. Simply put, the worst thing that could happen is that you identified the right market but picked decidedly the wrong time to enter that market. All this being said, and despite best efforts, sometimes companies do indeed fail with the timing of their emerging market commitment. And this should not be too surprising because, after all, no one ever has complete information. No one has a crystal ball to accurately predict what the future may hold. And sometimes it is the onset of truly unexpected developments that will ensure that the apparently very real market potential unravels. Consider, for example, the case of Diageo's expansion into the Turkish market. Timing was at the heart of that case study, as demonstrated by the fact that Diageo, a company that should have known its industry best, only acquired Meiji after a local consortium and then a financial buyer in the form of the Texas Pacific Group had previously acquired and then sold the company. The result of this timing was that Diageo paid a huge premium for Meiji, $2.1 billion compared to $300 million paid by the local consortium and $900 million paid by Texas Pacific Group. To make matters worse, Diageo's late market entry subsequently also exposed the company to an unexpected change in regulations that would severely constrain its expansion plans in the Turkish market. All this leaves us with one final question: how to do business in emerging markets? And this is what I would like to shed a little bit of light on in this last week. And we will then build on that discussion with a case study that reinforces the message that challenges and/or hurdles in emerging markets can, especially if approached with an entrepreneurial mindset, lead to significant opportunities and market success. At a basic level, and I doubt that this comes as a surprise to any of you because many, if not all of you, already have embraced this, buying into the notion of a global mindset is a most elementary and yet also critical factor of success for investing and operating in emerging markets, or any market for that matter. In other words, you need to display a high degree of flexibility, adaptability, and sensitivity to local conditions. Businesses who are dismissive of the local conditions and instead fall back on what they see as true and tested approaches and strategies that they may have deployed in other markets are as likely to fail as they are to succeed. The simple reality of local, political, economic, social, and cultural peculiarities makes a corporate my way or the highway approach, or in other words, take it or leave it approach, a highly untenable proposition. Kari Guittard, a former US State Department official, a founding principal at Global Engagement Partners, nicely underscores the importance of contextual flexibility and adaptability when she notes, quote, "Constant adaptation and disruption is the new global reality. The next generation of leaders must be prepared to compete and succeed in this evolving global context," end quote. If you think about it, constant adaptation and disruption are indeed an ongoing reality in emerging and frontier markets because they are embarking on growth and development paths that are invariably defined by evolving policy approaches, setbacks, and divergences. Again, think back to the Diageo case study and the shift in regulations governing the sale and advertising of alcoholic beverages as an illustrative example. Now, since I already mentioned the term global mindset, let me take a few minutes to briefly elaborate on this. It may be one of the more prominent buzzwords in global business today, and a wide variety of books and/or articles have addressed this concept, but very few publications have set out to make a direct connection to emerging and frontier market dynamics. And if you think about it, there really is no explicit need for discussing the importance of a global mindset purely from an emerging markets lens. The reason is very simple. The approaches and values that you internalize through the cultivation of a global mindset are transferable to any market. After all, if they would not be, we probably should not even talk about a global mindset. Now, having said this, I want to take a few minutes to highlight what I consider to be one of the more prominent and insightful books on the topic. And that book is Being Global: How to Think, Act, and Lead in a Transformed World. The authors, affiliated with the Thunderbird School of Global Management, identify 3 specific types of capital that are critical to nurturing a global mindset. The first dimension of global mindset is so-called global intellectual capital, which refers to the knowledge and understanding of the industry and the broader macro-level environment in which you are operating in. In other words, you understand global industry trends and developments, you are aware of changing dynamics, you have an appreciation of the competitive dynamics and business strategies that are relevant to international expansion. You have a keen sense of the do's and don'ts of doing business on an international level and are thus able to avoid cultural faux pas. And you also display an ability to absorb complex information, evaluate it, and then make informed decisions. And when doing so, you oftentimes still have to contend with high degrees of ambiguity and uncertainty, especially in emerging and frontier markets. People with intellectual capital also have an ability to grasp abstract ideas and project a rather cosmopolitan outlook. As such, you not only have knowledge about cultural differences and peculiarities of different world regions, but you also exhibit a high degree of cultural tolerance and sensitivity. And you find it generally easy to more or less comfortably adapt to and assimilate into foreign cultural contexts. These character traits will stand you in particularly good stead when it comes to business networking. And in emerging and frontier markets, it is especially critical to be well connected in order to navigate both formal and informal institutional landscapes. Psychological capital is the second component of a global mindset. People with a high level of psychological capital tend to embrace diversity and generally enjoy learning about different cultures, and perhaps more importantly still, are eager to fully immerse themselves into foreign cultures. Such people also display a near innate ability as well as a deep-seated interest in dealing with challenging situations. And this is a skill set that may very well make the difference between business success and failure in an emerging or frontier market, because you will invariably be confronted with setbacks and/or unexpected developments, even when terms have been officially recorded in contractual agreements. At the same time, people with high psychological capital are also quite able and willing to take on risks. Now, manageable risks, grant you, but risks nonetheless. And risks, as we all know all too well by now, are an indelible reality in all emerging or frontier market contexts. The final component of a global mindset is so-called global social capital. People endowed with this capital are generally able to work well with other people. They are easygoing and have an ability to easily diffuse tense situations. Moreover, they can easily pick up on verbal and nonverbal cues and can make emotional connections with people. Such character traits are highly valuable because when different people will interpret and react to situations and circumstances in different ways, they also draw different conclusions. Some people may see problems or opportunities where others do not. And even when people agree on the same problem or opportunity, they may look at it through a different analytical lens and consequently draw different conclusions and propose competing strategies. So the ability to manage such analytical divergences is of critical importance when operating in and/or leading teams of people in a cultural context that is fundamentally different from your own cultural reference point. In such situations, you need to have a feel for what is acceptable business behavior and what is not. For example, do you berate workers who do not meet their performance targets? And if you do you do it publicly or in private conversations? Do you single out individuals for praise for having done a great job? In more collective cultures, that might not be the most appropriate course of action. Shaming someone in front of their peers may result in that person losing face, while heaping praise on an individual may be equally wrong-footed. In short, people with high degrees of social capital, as described on the Thunderbird School of Global Management website, are those who have the ability to, quote, act in a way that helps build trusting relationships with people from other parts of the world, end quote. This concludes the brief overview of what a global mindset is all about. In part 2 of this week's lecture video, I will elaborate on some more substantive considerations for doing business in emerging markets, including highlighting the components of a business model canvas and making the case for business model flexibility and innovation. In doing so, I also lay the foundation for this week's India-focused Chotokul case study.